Malcolm here, and welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips. And today we're talking about how to talk about the communion meaningfully. This is our third go at this. In previous episodes, 107 and 108, we looked at an overview and then the Christus Victor model. Today, in episode 109, we're talking about the substitutionary model. I think it's so important in our talks about the communion or the Lord's Supper that we avoid the predictable and the boring, and the stuff we've heard 100 times before, but also we avoid going off on flights of fancy into some kind of a world of such creativity that we lose connection with the purpose of the communion. And as we think about the atonement, and I've taught on this before in more detail, so I'm giving a summarized version of some ideas here. As we focus on the atonement here, it may stimulate some thinking about how to give a communion talk that is fresh but focused. And that's my goal. We go deeper into these issues. So let's talk about this substitutionary model today, and then let me know, as you meditate on this idea, how this might help you in doing a good, helpful, and inspiring and refreshing talk about the communion. So the substitutionary model. Now, oh, by the way, all the scriptures that I'm going to reference or allude to will be in the show notes. There are too many to cover in a short video like this. So, pre-Reformation days, before the 1500s, between about 1000 AD and 1500, the substitutionary model came in and was perhaps the predominant model for the atonement. It's the Godward model, in other words, satisfying God. Last week we talked about satisfying, in a sense, Satan or evil. A key verse would be 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, which says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So Christ becoming sin for us, substituting for us. Isaiah 53, Romans 3, 23 to 26, key verses. Sometimes it's called the substitutionary model, sometimes the commercial model, the Latin model, or the Anselmian model. And I'll explain why that in just a moment. The New Testament emphasis has clarity on this in terms of vicarious suffering, justification, the propitiation, expiation ideas, and the idea of sacrifice, Christ making a sacrifice on our behalf. So it's a strong theme in the New Testament. Now, let's talk about Anselm for a minute. Anselm was an Archbishop of Canterbury. He lived from 1033 to 1109 AD, and he came up with the substitutionary model, or at least he codified it in a way that has been recorded and passed down to us. And he talked about 6 issues to do with the atonement. Firstly, that humans dishonored God by sinning. I don't think we could argue with that. Secondly, that we owe God restoration and reparation for this dishonoring. Thirdly, we are unable to restore and provide reparation because we're human. Therefore, we are in bondage, which again, the New Testament would support. What options does God have? He has 2 options. He has the option to punish us as we truly deserve, or secondly, to accept satisfaction made on our behalf. Key issue there in the substitutionary model. Satisfaction, Anselm argued, is only possible through a human because humans sinned, but no human has the resources to do this because no human is perfect. Therefore, Jesus is the ultimate solution. And again, who could argue with that? Because he was both human and divine. So those were Anselm's 6 ways of progressing down to that point of saying that the substitutionary model is a good explanation for the atonement. Now, after the Reformation, the idea of penal substitution came in. Key verse, Isaiah 53, verse 5. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. And the healing motive there we'll talk about next time. Romans 4:25, 1 Corinthians 5:21, 1 John 2 verse 2, other key verses again in the show notes. The point here being that God is righteous, therefore he must punish. It's not just that Jesus is the substitution, but he's penalized, the penal substitution idea. God, if he is righteous, he must punish. Christ's sacrifice satisfies justice in this model. That's why it's called penal substitution. A definition in a book I read says that penal substitution is like this. The Father, because of his love for human beings, sent his Son, who offered himself willingly and gladly to satisfy God's justice, so that Christ took the place of sinners. The punishment and penalty we deserved was laid on Jesus Christ instead of us, so that in the cross both God's holiness and love are manifested. This would be the key or the predominant theme in most of Christianity today, certainly within evangelicalism, penal substitution, and it has been challenged in recent times, Steve Chalke amongst others, and you have to make up your own mind whether it's an accurate view or perspective on what Jesus did for us. But then you had the substitutionary model and the penal substitutionary model. Three themes within this: the sinfulness of humanity. God looked for faithfulness in Israel, but it was flawed. God being holy, there were sacrifices in the Old Covenant, of course we know that. And we are not only sinners, but we're guilty for that sin, Romans 2, verse 1, and we are condemned before God, Romans 5. The payment and wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. God's wrath rests on those who disobey the Son, John 3:36 and following. And hard and resistant hearts will face judgment, Romans 2, verses 5 and 16. God's righteous judgment means that those who have disobeyed the gospel will face eternal destruction when Jesus comes again, 2 Thessalonians 5 and following. Chapter 1, verse 5 and following. Judgment is according to works, Romans 2, 6 to 11. And all those who have practiced evil will be judged before the great white throne, Revelation 20. Therefore we have the sinfulness of humanity laid out clearly in the Old and New Covenants. The holiness of God is also part of this equation because he is holy. Law breaking is not impersonal for God. His laws aren't imposed from something without him, outside of him. They come from within him. It's very personal. Anti-law, to live against law is to live against his lordship and against who he is. So it is personal, and God does judge sin retributively. Adam and Eve are judged. The flood comes because of God's judgment on humankind. Babel, the Canaanites are driven out. The affliction during the time of the judges, we can see that, and ultimately the exile of the Israelites in the Old Covenant, Old Testament. In the New Testament, there are many warnings about God's judgment, from John the Baptist through to Jesus, the apostles' preaching, and Paul's writings. God is personally angry towards sin. It hurts him and it hurts those he loves. Sin, as this book I read said, does lead to judgment, but in the biblical worldview, judgment represents the personal response of the Holy Lord to human sin. His anger is not arbitrary, it is against sin. How does the sacrifice of Christ come into this? In the Old Testament, we see many sacrifices, but most were connected with forgiveness. The laying hands on an animal probably meant that the guilt is transferred from the human to the animal in the Old Testament way of doing things. The death of the animal shows the seriousness of sin. That only death pays the debt. The Day of Atonement, the lamb that is slain, seems to show that the sacrifices were made in place of the worshippers, so that the punishment due to Israel could be averted. We've got the goat in Leviticus 16, the laying on of hands, the sin connection, the substitution, and the exile of that goat. And Isaiah 53 verse 10 we talked about earlier, Jesus, looking at that as a prophecy, became a guilt offering, taking the punishment sinners deserve. In the New Testament, in Romans 3, we see both expiation and propitiation for sins. In Galatians chapter 3 verses 10 to 14, Christ became our substitute. He was cursed in our place. Substitution there. Matthew chapter 20 verse 28, Jesus sees himself as a ransom for many. He takes the cup of God's wrath in Mark 14. He's handed over to others because of God's wrath, and there's darkness coming over the land. He's forsaken, he's mocked. Penal substitution does seem to be in the frame there. How does Jesus benefit sinners? Says the book I read. He benefits them by taking the punishment and guilt they deserve by dying in their place. Substitution. So in conclusion, some strengths and weaknesses. Strengths of this model. It is very God-focused. That's a great strength. We benefit from what Christ did for us. The focus is on the glory of God, not the good we are done. And this inspires us, this model of substitution, to imitate Christ's self-giving love in the way that we live. Lots of Bible verses support the idea of substitution and penal substitution. There are some weaknesses in the model, but I'm not going to express those. I would like to know what you think. What do you think are some of the strengths I haven't mentioned? And what do you think might be the weaknesses of this model? Pop a comment into the comment box below. Then we can learn from each other, and we learn best when we learn in community, don't we? So please do that. Next week, we will talk about the healing model of the atonement. and that I hope will be useful. I got some questions just to finish with. How might this view of the atonement, the substitutionary model, the penal substitution model, how might it be brought to life in a communion talk? That next talk you do about the Lord's Supper, how might this come in? How might it be helpful? What scriptures can you use? What images can you use? What stories that connect to this model might give people confidence as they take that bread and wine that their sin debt has been paid, that their guilt has been removed, that Jesus died in their place? What could you do to express that well? I'd love to know what you think. Also, a favor, please pass this link on to one other person who might benefit. And then if you've got time, hit the like button and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so that we can spread the word and so that you can be notified when the next recording is uploaded. I hope this has been helpful. Next time we'll talk about healing, the healing model. But until then, I hope you have a terrific Tuesday and a wonderful week. God bless.